because I come out of a family. My mother was a suffragette, and that goes back, of course, a long way. I'm 86 now, so, well, let's see. That was at the turn of the 20th century. And her being a suffragette was something that was very significant in our lives. When I hear of people breaking windows on the street, I don't feel, perhaps, as some of you may feel, that these are kind of objectionable, violent people. My mother was, in that sense, an objectionable, violent person who broke windows in a London store and went to jail. And so, like, they achieved suffrage. And that has been so fundamental in how we have been able to go on from there. But nonetheless, we were still in a box as women, I mean. We were still excluded. We were still outside. We were still not part of the cultural, the intellectual, the artistic, the political world as subjects, as speakers, as agents. We had no presence. This has been a major, major achievement of the second women's movement. Not, I want to emphasize, not that there isn't much, and I'm going to go on and address some of my concerns in what where I get to, and hope if I get to the end of what I have sketched out here, which I may not, but the thing that I think is so extraordinary is having learned how to speak among women, with women, and indeed, of course, way back and perhaps still, to quarrel vigorously. And I have always thought that, in fact, those quarrels, those deep quarrels of all kinds on race and ethnic issues and various kinds of issues, were in fact how the women's movement spread and spread and spread. And the one thing that we all had in common was the importance that women were subjects, were speakers, had agency in the public discourse. And we have made that difference. If you think now today that there are 3 women premiers in Canada. There's Clark in British Columbia, there's Redford in Alberta, there's Marois in Quebec. They're not feminists. They are women, politicians, and they are operating as such. No doubt they are in various ways, take women's issues up differently than they otherwise might be. But to recognize that these are very, very significant achievements, I think, is extremely important. And to me, institutional ethnography comes out of that experience in the sense it's a political battle between women coming from various places, making ourselves heard, but also listening to each other, hearing other women. Because you wouldn't even believe it, I suppose, now, but let's say 30, 40 years ago, like if I was teaching a class in sociology and I had to, I'm big, not necessarily lay long, but maybe 60 people, and I'd ask if there were any questions at the end, and I would only look towards the men. I would never look. The women would never speak. And that shift to women speaking is a very, very, I was really happy, by the way, with to hear that a one-woman politician had elocution lessons, so that she could speak more effectively. So, great. That's the way. We have to see that this is a significant achievement. But what I want to do here is say, I want a third women's movement. And before I go on to say what that third women's movement is, or what I see it, I want to talk a bit about where institutional ethnography came from. Because my notion of a third women's movement comes out of what I have come to understand as an institutional ethnographer, and also from what we have learned as institutional ethnographers. And I would stress, I think institutional ethnography is perhaps unusual, is we learn from one another's research. We learn how to do things we didn't know how to do and we learn things about aspects of the society that we didn't know before. And that's very important. Now, we want to speak, however, of some of what was there at an earlier period when, first of all, let me just show you this. This is actually a picture of women sitting around a table talking. And one of the things about those early days is that we didn't have any language. We didn't have, like in our political language, I said, we had to talk to one another about our experiences. And this was then, hopefully this will actually work. This computer is being very lazy today. So I'm not going to rely on it, but it should behave. Come on, behave, behave. Well, no. It doesn't want to. It doesn't want to. We'll just forget about it. I think we'll just forget about it. I'll just detach it and speak to it. I don't really need it. I just have some nice pictures, so we can turn it off. So anyway, some of the experiences we had in the early days in British Columbia, and Roxana will remember these. We had a very different context for working. And one of it was, of course, that it was almost as if the possibility of women speaking out was something that sort of spread like wildfire once women realized that we could do this. But in the kind of research that we began to evolve, I had found that there were serious problems with the standard sociological methods. And these were ones that what they did was relegate people to the status of the objects of study. And so I remember on one occasion, although I think it was a little bit later, I remember getting a complaint from a group of union women who we talked to about whether we could work with them. And they said the problem with working with you sociologists is you always end up studying us. And then they sort of walked out, and that was it. But we began to develop a different kind of approach that was coming out of thinking that I had, in part, been doing a little earlier on, because during the period of Canadianization, one of the things that hit me was that I had been trained profoundly in the standard sociological approaches, theory and method, at one of the sort of classy universities, the University of California at Berkeley. And then, in a way, I came, as a sort of almost like the Roman Empire was run, to essentially teach the provinces how to think. And that was provinces with a small p, of course, in the metaphorical sense. And then I had realized that there were some problems with how could I begin to think differently and start somewhere else. And I remembered I had read when I was at the London School of Economics, previous to my Berkeley experience, I had read a book by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called The German Ideology. And in there, I had recalled that there was this astonishing section where they're talking about how, forget all this speculation, forget all this theory, forget all this stuff, we're going to start with actual people, their work, and the conditions of their work. And that idea, to me, suddenly kind of returned, if you like, in relationship to the women's movement, because I could begin to see then we could start where women actually were in their lives, and begin, though, not to come to rest there, but begin to explore and examine, like, how the kinds of issues and problems they were confronting were embedded, were connected up with these relations which we came to call the relations of ruling. But you might call them something different. It doesn't matter too much, and I'll give you an idea of what that looks like. And one of the kinds of work we did was work that I came to call pre-organizational work. And I was going to give you an example of this. There was, I think this was something that was organized perhaps by Jean Arrington, and it was under an NDP government, however brief, in British Columbia. And one of the things they were concerned about was some of the situations of women in single industry towns in northern BC. And so we started doing work with them, which was simply learning from them what kinds of issues and problems they had. Well, these were not necessarily, he said, no, we're not going to start with what feminists think will be the issues. We're going to ask them what their everyday problems are. And let me give you one example. It was in Kidderminster. And that is an example of a woman describing the problem she had during the winter when the snow was piled up on the sides of the street. It had been shoveled, of course, and it had plowed, and it might be 6 feet. And if you're coming down the hill, and it's a bit hilly, you've got to go down to there to do your shopping, and you've got a baby buggy. There's no sidewalk. So you're in danger, like your child is in danger. What can you do? So one of the things we could do is begin to say, this is an issue. Now, where do you have to go in order to begin to get solutions to this kind of issues? Who do you struggle with? Who do you fight? And at the same time, there was we were doing the same kind of work in different single industry towns in different parts of the, and Jean Errington was able to organize them and bring them together. I think it was probably in Prince George, and have a conference at which they came together, began to talk about their common problems and to organize and to begin to get some changes happening. Now, one of the things I want to stress about this, and I think I'm going to come back and kind of talk about some of the dilemmas of institutional ethnography. One of the kinds of things that was possible at that time, I actually, what my experience was that you could actually get money to organize a conference. You could get the federal government to give you money to organize a conference of this kind. Would you be able to do that now? No way. That's a very important thing. I actually went to Wikipedia to look up Trudeau, not Justin, but Pierre Elliott. And because I just want to check the dates that I'm talking about the same. And I had had the impression about Trudeau, although I have many have many criticisms of him, that he had actually taken seriously that the government should be active in the building of democracy. And indeed, the term is used, I don't know what it means exactly in Wikipedia, it's participatory democracy, but that was sort of a modest confirmation of my sense is that he actually spent money and was willing to spend money on supporting people in voicing their issues and questions and problems. No, that doesn't happen. Now I want to turn from there, if I can remember exactly, I'm going to say something now about institutional ethnography and where that comes from. You can begin to see how starting with where people are and beginning to sort of look up and in makes a difference. Now, in one of the slides I was going to show you, and I'm sort of sorry about this one, there's an account that actually comes out of a book by Janet Rankin and Marie Campbell, which is called Managing to Nurse, and I recommend it to any of you to read, not just if you're involved in the health system at all. It's a very fun and very fascinating and very disturbing piece of work. But at the very beginning, there's an account of nurses coming on shift, and it refers to, registered nurses, and I forget now, excuse me, no, have to forgive my 86 years, you have all kinds of privileges of forgetting, so that's one of them. The different kind of qualifications of nurses, the different organizational shifts, the term hospital in itself. You begin to think about that, and you think, but this is a description of nurses coming on shift. But embedded in this description is terms that you cannot find fully referenced in any particular local situation. Think about like what a hospital is, or what a university is. There's some kind of definite legal process. In British Columbia, they'll have a corporate form of organization. There will be requirements that have to be met in terms of the qualifications of people who are engaged in the various, and et cetera, et cetera. Where do qualifications come from? They come from colleges and universities. So at each moment of description, at each moment in our everyday lives, we find we're actually hooked in to these complex of institutional relations or organizational relations or column building relations, whatever, but in any case, they go beyond anything that we can see directly. And that, if you like, is where institutional ethnography goes. And I was going to have this little picture of what we call the small hero diagram. It's a picture of a woman sitting there and she's looking up into the kind of institutional processes. That's the work of exploration. Now, in this work of exploration, a very key aspect of it has been our discovery of how texts enter into the coordinating of people's behavior. The only way in which it becomes possible to develop an ethnography that goes beyond the kind of locally observable is to begin to understand and recognize and involve in your investigations how texts enter into the coordinating of people's activities. Now, you're not treating texts as they're treated in discourse. Well, there are a whole variety of discourse theories, and many of them are very interesting. I'm not dismissing them. But I'm saying you're not treating the text in abstraction. People actually activating them or writing them or being governed by them in various ways, because those are actual practical processes, things that people do in the course of their work and their doings of various kinds. And you just think of seeing a stop sign on a street. Where does that come? Just think of seeing like the number of a bus, and just think of the whole kind of complex background, scheduling, etc., etc. That is all text stuff. And in institution ethnography, you pull text into your ethnographic practice so you can begin to understand and see, make visible how they're actually put together. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a huge mass of text, etc., but you've got to have text. Now, the one thing I'm really sorry that now I wonder if I can rescue this in any way, because I just actually wanted to see it for myself. Because I wanted to read it to you if I can find it. It's kind of gone, I think. Just a sec or two, if I can locate it. Anyway, this is a little bit where I sort of forgot I might. Sorry, it's a lot of hot air here, and I don't think it's me.
Oh, is it? Is the machine probably? Turn off.
Have you turned it off? Is anyone familiar with it?
Yeah.
Hit it twice.
Hit twice.
Yeah, I thought I pressed it. Or maybe
There we go.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. Okay, so I want to introduce a notion that first came to me when I was reading a book by William James Gibson. I think it's called Vietnam, the Techno Wars. So if I got it right. And I was going to show you a couple of passages from this book in which he describes the processes and practices that were introduced into under Johnson's presidency, into ways in which the outcomes of different engagements, and indeed for the war in Iraq, were being judged in terms of body counts were very important, and the ratios of body counts that as they were evaluated among the American troops and the Viet Cong. And the basis of much of what the aims and directions of warfare began to be guided by the representations that had in statistical forms of evaluating the progress that the troops were making. And in part it wasn't just body count, there were costs of, et cetera, equipment, and da-da-da-da. And in Gibson's book, one of the things that he does is also to describe, based or draw on autobiographical accounts of the way in which particular kind of on-the-ground kind of attempts were made that were not designed, in a sense, as in the sort of traditional way to maybe sort of actually bring about a fight and win ground and et cetera, but were rather designed in order to bring out Viet Cong or Vietnamese, so that they could be killed from the air, so that they could be. And of course, in doing that, risks were to the American troops that were not in any way kind of taken into account, apparently, because in this kind of new system of measuring and evaluation, you could, in a sense, look simply at what you might think were the overall outcomes that you were getting in terms, in enumerated terms. Now, one of the things that I certainly have seen in part out of the work of institutional ethnographers. Oh, sorry, I'm going to come back to that, I think. What I have come to think of is that I need a term that I'm going to use, and I want you not to freak about this. I want to talk about imaginaries. Not as Sartre does, not as a matter of like individual dreaming, imagination, poetic, artistic, etc., etc. I want to suggest that the representations that guided the Johnson administration in the war in Vietnam was an imaginary, that it was disconnected from the realities on the ground. And actually, if you read Gabriel Colto's very excellent book, which looks at the war from the point of view of the Vietnamese, it looks very, very different. And in fact, you can see that, in fact, a lot of what was happening was just simply not visible. Why was it not visible? You read Gibson's book and you can begin to see the creation of this kind of world that exists in textual realities and is disconnected from the actualities that people are actually living, doing, dying. Now, I don't have available for you a proper example. Well, I do. I'm going to give you an example. I might suggest you begin thinking about it. But if you want to kind of test me about, how much I know about this at the moment, I'm doing some reading, but I'm not entirely there. I want to suggest that it might not be a bad idea to begin to think about the economy as an imaginary. Now, if you sort of think about like how money operates and how it translates, and this is something actually that Marx has some other interesting passages on, how it translates local and particular actualities and relations between people into these abstract forms. And once that begins to take off, as it has, certainly with the development of the kind of transnational forms of organization, particularly perhaps in the financial field, you're beginning to see the invention of a world which has its consequences where we live, but never represents them or takes them into account in their actualities as we live them. And that's where institutional ethnography returns us to. Now, in the work of institutional ethnographers recently, there has been a very valuable development of an understanding of new forms of managerial processes. When I referred to Janet Rankin and Marie Campbell's work, it's called Managing to Nurse. It's about the introduction of managerial organization into a hospital in British Columbia, and like how nurses have to kind of work in a sense to produce the managerial requirements without necessarily they're making any sense in terms of patients. Now, these managerial processes are becoming getting these incredible kind of technological developments of various kinds, which are designed, of their technological design, ways of representing what, let's say, the government gives money for this. It wants outcomes and performance, etc. The outcomes and performance have to be measurable in some way. Maybe not immediately in terms of money, but down the line so that they can be translated into cost. So you're getting these, you find this in universities. This is something that almost certainly is happening here in the University of Toronto, in Oise, This is not something that in a sense is chosen, but it is something that is we are being drawn into, in a sense. So we are being drawn into the makings of this kind of, the generalization of the economic imaginary, if you like. And this is still something, I'm putting forward in this kind of open way when I'm saying, let's begin to think in this way. But it doesn't seem to me sort of out to lunch if I think of some of the kind of current economic policies, that this is not what is happening, that this is not how it works. That if I think about the gross domestic product, like I'm sort of doing this in bed when I'm a little feverish, and I thought, gross domestic product? Wait a minute. But if you think about this as like an imaginary representation of welfare, which actually doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with what's actually happening with people. And so, like this kind of disjuncture, I think, is something that we need to begin to address and explore. Now I want to kind of say something. I see two issues for institution ethnography. I see this work, which is developing and ongoing, and as we go further into it, we begin to see these connections, not just looking at what is happening with teachers, what's happening with nurses, as these new forms of managerial aspect of managerial practices are being entered into their work organization, but how these are connected up internationally. I mean, I can describe for you, I'm not going to do it, but doing a little kind of tracking on the internet and starting out with a superintendent in Richmond, British Columbia, and ending up in the OECD, and those kind of things. You can do that kind of thing because those connections actually do exist. And it's true, you have to find ways in institutional ethnography of translating them back into how they're actually put together as work organization. Nonetheless, you can begin to see how it's put together. What we don't have is what was possible in the single industry towns in northern BC. We don't have a connection with a political process. That information or that knowledge that it was very touching in the recent meetings at the Society for the Study of Social Problems in Denver. Society for the Study of Social Problems actually has an Institute of Ethnography division. And there was a brilliant presentation by Karen Mellon, who had, she'd done far too much for her Master of Nursing, but it's a very fine piece of work looking at how emergency nursing is managed and describing the pressures, the stress that in some sense are actually being produced in this kind of organizing process that is operating at the front line between where professionals are and those they are attempting to serve. And one of the things that when she has spoken, she said, yes, she can tell nurses, and nurses, of course, know what she's talking about. But is there anything they can do? Is there any way you could see that having this knowledge actually makes it possible, as it did in the Kidnap example, to go somewhere, to make changes, even they may be modest, but nonetheless, real. Now, I don't have any answer to this, but I want to talk very briefly about my third women's movement. And perhaps I'm going to read it because I'm feeling a little unsteady at this point. See, my hands are shaking. Okay. So I want to suggest another step. Not equality, but beyond equality. A voice that speaks from the household, from where children are fed, warmed, cared for, from where people are fed, warmed, and cared for, or not. What work is this? Not asking for wages for housework, that's not what I'm talking about, but for a voice that begins here, not assimilated to categories like class, but grounded in people's everyday lives. And of course, not exclusively women or for women, but but this is a region where women work distinctively because we do have a special and physical relation to children and are still, in multiple ways, tied into work in that relationship. But it's not just women. It's for people and for where and who we are in our realities and as they are, and not those of the economic imaginary that mediates our world. Now, I just when I was beginning to kind of put this together, I talked to my friend Alison Griffiths. What else shall I say? And she said, reminded me that a couple of years, about 18 months ago, was I talked in Fredericton, and I talked about, I just read in the newspaper, there's a story that I told in a panel conversation. And this was about immigrant women who had been moved into high-rises in suburban Toronto. I forget exactly where, you'll have to forgive me. It had been originally designed as a middle-class area. In consequences, there were no stores within reach. There was a mall about 2 kilometers away. All their shopping had to be done on foot. They had to walk as far and take as long as it took, because it had been designed to depend on people who had cars. They didn't have cars. There was no public transportation. And it's getting to that ground where people are actually living, not talking simply about poverty or low income, but saying what is actually happening here. How is this to be taken up? How can we move from here to begin to oppose, even if you don't accept my sort of theoretical notion of an imaginary? You can see that there's a problem about these kind of level of accounts from people of where they are that locate them in their local actualities, confronts what I'm calling the economic imaginary. And we need that to be confronted. That's what I call the third women's movement. Thank you.
Okay, Dorothy needs to rest, but Dorothy, would you take a few questions?
Sure, no problem.
Okay. So any comments and questions? I'm going to stand up so that I can see people's hands up. Speak now or...
Sorry if it didn't fit exactly the framework that you...
Oh, sorry, Jamie. Go ahead. What?
I was expecting someone, many more people to jump in, so I hadn't quite formulated my question, but I was just excited about the idea of the economic imaginary, especially in terms of financialized imaginaries. And I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to everyday actualities.
Well, I mean, I think it's, it's a fairly straightforward in some ways. I mean, actually, I'm currently kind of doing quite a lot of reading, and I'm not at the stage where I know how to speak this stuff. But just this kind of very straightforward thing is you look at what is happening in the United States in relation to housing. Because I remember going to Southern California not all that long ago before the crisis, and there were these nutty little boxes being built all over the foothills, which, I felt. These were, goodness knows what's happened to them now. Now maybe the wind has come and blown them away. But it's clear that that kind of what Stiglitz calls the Great Recession, absolutely it's very ordinary and is still having that impact on people's lives in terms of being able to have a house, or even, in the United States, and that's still something that's happening. People are also paying, of course, for the houses that they bought, that cost. So those kind of things, to begin, but I also think that, for me, these things like well, where do you go shopping? Well, when I'm in Vancouver, living with my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren there, and I'm not driving anymore. I can't. Actually, I do have a driver's license, but I don't. And I can walk. I can do all my shopping walking.
Yeah.
Now, that's an extraordinary situation to be in. And we don't examine, like, these kinds of ways in which, like, a sort of concrete, we don't sort of look at. For example, there is a very excellent study, and I think, in fact, it did make some changes at the University of Victoria that was done looking at how students with disability did their work as a practical matter of getting around on campus, finding where to go, like being able to hear, and et cetera, because there are multiple kinds of disabilities. And this was a very good study. It actually looked at how in the university this was taken up, which was pretty ruthless. But they actually have, I think, introduced a number of changes, which provide, in many ways, but looking very concretely. How do you get to class, for example? Well, we kind of, if we teach, we take for granted that students will arrive at class more or less on time, and that is part of how you class. But there's that work of getting here, going there, finding a way, and now, fortunately, perhaps not so much of time spending going to the library, because you can do so much more on the computer, but nonetheless, there is all this kind of work organization that is mostly invisible and is not made visible. For example, you have architects doing these kind of fine design which they believe will make a living area more human, etc., but they have no idea, so far as I've ever been able to see, of looking at what people are doing on the ground and what's already there and how that's already lived. And it's that locating that living that I want us to be more aware of. I'm not just talking about institutional ethnography. I'm talking about beginning to see, beginning to want to know, beginning to ask other kinds of questions and raise other kinds of issues.
Yes, I wonder how you would relate imaginaries to the university.
Well, of course, the university is a great place for creating imaginaries. Feeding imaginaries. No. Yes, I mean, to a significant extent. I mean, actually, engineering would be a very good example of, a massive contribution to the imaginary of a managed world. They're trying to propose to build a seawall along a stretch of beach in Vancouver that I'm particularly fond of. And, well, there you go. A little bit of a sort of planned imaginary that will actually disrupt a whole complex of living beings. Not just us, but all kinds of, small flora and fauna and fish. And, so there was another question here, just a second.
I was going to ask how you would differentiate the way you're using imaginary from a discourse.
Well, because it actually is a discourse as such. I mean, there would be discourses associated. You would be interpenetrated. But an imaginary actually is if you take the notion of textual reality, one of the things that I didn't perhaps say enough about it is it's very fundamental is going from people's actualities to some textual form which represents the reality for institutional or organizational purposes. So with the institution, if you take, let's say, a legal process, it just could say something very briefly about a paper that Susan and I have been rereading lately by George Smith. And one of the things he looks at is the policing of the gay community. The police come into a steam bath where gay guys are enjoying themselves sexually, and they write a description of it which is fitted to what in Ontario is called the Boarding House Law. I think we still have it, don't we? And in order for action to be taken, they have to write an account. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact these guys are having fun. It has, or indeed what they're actually doing, but it has to do with how you represent it so it fits the categories of the law. Only then can it become something that is the bringing of charges against the manager, against the owner, against the people the men founded. So beginning to kind of see the ways in which the textual realities actually establish like a version of the world in terms of which it becomes actionable by within an institutional or organizational or other kinds of processes of the same order. Is that helpful to people? Yeah. So discourses enter into, of course, but they're not as such. This is not a discourse.
There's a hand up there, but Jane, you also had your hand up.
Actually,
Or is
Lorena
Lorena?
had her hand
Oh,
up.
So
sorry,
how about
but I
Lorena
didn't see
first,
it.
and then
Please.
you at the back?
Yeah.
Oh, me,
Go ahead.
I was really enthralled by the whole going back to how it's lived when you were talking about, you know, walking and shopping and all that.
Yeah.
When we first came, and well, I've never driven in my life. I'm an eco-friendly being, but it wasn't by choice at the beginning. And we did live in those buildings, and we had to walk forever to just go
Yeah.
get food. So yes, it's the lived reality. But I also was thinking of how that then, in terms of the movement, right, of a political movement, then that by going there.
I'm
then
not going to invent it, but you might think of starting these things off in small ways. If you think about
Yeah.
the Kitimat, the company town example,
Yeah.
like you're not necessarily doing like Occupy. I mean, I'm not criticizing Occupy, but they're saying, okay, let's just begin, you know, where we are and begin to not just say there's something wrong here,
Yeah.
but like how to go about it. And having conversations with my daughter-in-law here, who's a teacher, and one of the things that is driving her nutty is that how many hours she has to spend after her work hours wrestling with writing the reports, etc., under the, you know, what sound like the absolutely stupid exigencies that have been imposed by the Ministry of Education on her. And, you know, she describes these to me, and she spends all these time. And we were talking about this, and what we were beginning to say is somehow or other, we can't move in the direction, academics and teachers can't move in the direction of factory workers in terms of, you know, being paid by the hour.
Yeah.
We're salaried, and the salary is something that means that your labor time is indefinitely inexhaustible, and that they can shove more and more work, and somehow or other you get it done. Now, beginning to say, well, isn't there some way the union could take this up? Maybe actually talk about having a monthly limit on how many extra hours, so that not so that you were being paid more, but so there was a cost to the Board of Education in the Ontario, whatever it's called. So you could begin. We were talking about this, and then maybe she might take it back to the union because she's very active in the union. So.
But that's what I'm talking about. What I was thinking is the possibility of then, like, because you're focusing on that, on what is actually happening, then the possibility of action widens, right? It doesn't become circumscribed by only one thing.
No, yeah, it does.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can have like different. You can link, you know, in the case of a street that you want paved, for example.
Well, there you
can
go.
link
You
up-
see, she knows. She's got ideas about how to go on that. So.
I'm just saying. I mean, it's
Isn't it?
It's amazing.
You know,
I love that.
you don't think I can be the source.
Okay.
I'm saying it's up to you guys.
We're all the sources.
I made a 6.
Yes, go ahead.
My question is about that we also know that there is other issue about the third wave feminism that some believe that it's the effect of technology on women's life, specifically youth, you know, or young women. And they call it cybernet. And even we can see the shift in art and other program in university that how they use technology in their program and encourage young to use it. From this perspective, how do you challenge your definition with this kind of definition or discourse?
Well, I'm not sure you would start out in that generalized way. I almost feel like handing it over to Susan, who's actually done some work with students. Do you want to? No? You don't want to. Okay. So, I mean, I would like to start with, I don't necessarily have the answer. I haven't done the research. But I can begin to say, I know that you would have to start with something concrete. What's going on? And begin to do that process of exploration, begin to say, well, let's look at, how this is actually being put together in these relations, which I don't know anything about at this point, but I can find out. And that's finding out. And there are certainly models of making change that Susan herself has been very effective in terms of, because she's done these very, very innovative at the time, although now we come to take them for granted, textual analyses of, not textual analyses, I shouldn't use that term, but analyses of the kind of text sequences that bring about in what in her study was of a municipal land development decision. So you can begin to see how it's actually put together, and indeed begin to see where changes might be made. And indeed, they were able, in fact, to make minor changes, not major transformations, but minor changes that actually shifted the ways in which, in this particular city in Ontario, the processes of making decisions that took somehow more into account environmental could be changed. So, but you always have to begin somewhere in the actuality of people's lives and what's going on there. So, go ahead, Susan.
I guess I would just add, because you invited me, that in thinking about, the internet or cybernet, or you can think that these are imaginaries that you can't get hold of.
This is not imaginaries in the same sense at all. You're using it. Thanks, Susan. I didn't fully hear it.
But particularly if you're thinking about, how do we get hold of what's happening through the internet, or, an institutional ethnography, you're always looking at, people in their bodies doing things, so that you begin. That's where you begin to take on something as challenging as, cybernets or, whatever else, whatever other concept.
Yes, and I don't mean that by imaginaries things that are not, properly speaking, factual, or things that, and I don't mean by imaginary something that is in an individual's head. I am talking about a distinctive form of social organization that is built out of textual realities that are systematically framed and translated, transcribe, or whatever you want to call it, from the actualities, which are never, of course, fully representable, but these are ones that represent it only in ways where it actually has some evaluative measure of performance or outcomes, or et cetera, so that you can estimate the costs, even though you may not be able to otherwise enter them into the monetary kind of relation. And that's, where I suppose I would want to say we have to begin, or we, if it interests you, we could begin to explore, and it's certainly something I'm very interested in doing, even though, it's just a beginning. But it has the kind of potential of beginning to understand this process of translation that goes from what we know directly, and I think of this seawall in British Columbia, of course it makes me angry, but also, beginning to learn something about how this kind of local ecological thing is put together, even though it's not visibly kind of stunning ecologically or anything like that. But a seawall is this abstract imposition of something that will attract tourists and bicyclists and et cetera, and will be the work designed by engineers, of course, who are very good at creating the abstractions that fit into the economic imaginary.
Well, comments? Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Dorothy. It's good to hear you talking I have a slightly different question with, all the way through your talk and in responses to the questions. You've let us in a little glimpse into your own work processes as you go about, doing institutional ethnography, but also as you sort of opening up new areas of questions for yourself. And could you say a little bit more about that? I'm very intrigued by you and find it very heartening when you say, oh, I don't really know very much about that, I'm just learning it. Because I think it's so, I find it very motivating, I guess. And it seems this kind of combination of you're curious about something, you're working with someone, you're having conversation, you're reading, but these are our work processes.
It does come out of some, it's actually 3 or 4 years ago, Alison Griffiths and I put together a workshop that actually took place here at OISI, and it was brought together institutional ethnographers who were doing investigations of the ways in which these kind of managerial processes were reorganizing the public sector, but they were looking at particular cases. Once you begin to look at that, you then have to kind of say, well, okay, like, how come? And I went back to, a paper that George Smith and I wrote in 1988. And one of the things that we identified there, which we perhaps didn't see the full significance of, was this change, I suppose in the Mulroney government, yes, from, there was at that time, prior to, would have been 86 or so, a Ministry of Employment and Immigration, which provided services to people. Its name was changed at this period into the Ministry of Human Resources. What are human resources? You've got a shift in how the labor market is being viewed that is oriented to how it will work for and attract capital investment. And you can begin to see this whole, which is something I've spent some time looking at, this reorganization of the federal state or the national state into, it's not just happening in Canada, which follows on the shift away from when the economy was somewhat manageable within a given nation state to one that is no longer has that character at all. Like the economy in some sense is like a kind of a transnational organization. And you can see this in Harper's kind of moves to in fact make this more sort of hook up Canada more effectively other than with the United States. And that is, but that changes the whole kind of progressively, you can see these kind of changes, the changes in the way in which educational policies are developed, the changes in the universities, the ways in which universities are increasingly oriented towards, like producing for capital either, and you actually have way back, and I forget now when this would be, and I can probably track it down, probably late 80s or early 90s, the World Bank had a great big conference in Paris, which was for university administrators. And what was being put forward there was like this redesign of the universities, where universities, faculty would be employees, the corporations would be their employers, and the students would be consumers. And this is certainly something that, although I don't know how actually effective it's been, but this is the kind of direction that it's not in a simple way imposed, but in a sense, in order to attract investment, retain investment, bring investment in, the nation state has to function very differently from how it did in the past. So these are some of the kinds of things that became visible, and some of this stuff I'm talking about on the nation state came out of, like, when I'd heard all these things about what's happening in education, what's happening in the healthcare system, and and in universities, etc., and not just here. In just thinking of English speaking, in the beginning of the development here, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is very significant because, like, what it has helped to do is begin to standardize the literacy levels across different countries, so they can be compared. And the OECD is sort of a bit like a club of about sort of 30 countries. and they are measured, ranked against one another, levels of education, testing, and all this kind of thing, like become something that has this kind of standardized character. So, you know, if you're making decisions about investment, you can sort of pick and choose. Shall we go to Finland? What would be the disadvantages of, you know, because it has an excellent educational system, but on the other hand, it's sort of a bit off the beaten track. You know, I don't know, like, you know, how decisions would be made. But, you know, but you could begin to take into account these ranked measurements against one another in making investment decisions. So you can begin to see, and certainly in my academic lifetime I've seen major changes in the orientation and organization of universities in the direction of, in a sense, kind of, you know, this serving capital. Now, I don't want to get kind of too simple-minded about that, because in a sense, like, you know, this is one of the things that a government has to do, because you want to, you know, you want to keep people earning and, you know, and living well, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to do this, you're operating within a transnational system you don't control. So everything, you know, you do in institutional ethnography is fascinating, et cetera, and often a bit depressing.
Any more comments, questions?
I think maybe I've had it.
Oh, there's one more, and then
Okay, and then I've
then
had it.
we're going to give Dorothy a rest. Philip, go ahead.
She's going to take it.
Actually, just focusing on the depression, it was like, welcome. I just did institutional ethnography for one project. But
Could you speak up a bit? My hearing isn't too great.
Actually, I always wondered when doing institutional ethnography, where comes the movement, we're analyzing institutional relations and things like that. And where are the concepts for changing it, or like getting counterpower into to change the institutions?
Well,
Like,
well,
for me it's sometimes depressing, because then I see how it works, or how it how.
Well, you know, if you sort of being to ask about kind of changing the whole system, you know, I don't know. I don't know how, and I think this is something that you know, works like Occupy, et cetera, we have to begin talking about it. But I want to begin talking in ways that recognize this as sort of concrete. And I think there are kind of initiatives. What I'm concerned about is, I suppose, like, because I had experience, you know, when I was in England. I didn't leave until the 50s, I guess. I wasn't in the 50s, but it was, I was in my mid-30s, and I had been very active politically. And one of the things that was very striking during the period I was politically active in Britain was a working class that was absolutely aware, was active politically, would come together and work around elections and etc. in a way I think you'd find it very hard to see nowadays. Now, beginning, and in many ways I saw a similar kind of process in the women's movement. People coming together, having things to say, to do, and this is where, of course, we got our quarrels, because they would be going, but the quarrels were very productive in the women's movement, because people organized, they selected things they wanted to get changed, they did. Now, there are kinds of approaches to making change. That Susan is one of the innovators in that area, and there's a very, unfortunately, she died recently, a woman called Ellen Pence, who's done very important work on making change in the processes of the judicial processes on domestic abuse in the United States, and particularly in Minnesota. And so there are kind of change making, but I'm looking, I suppose, I'm not being opposed to that. I'm looking for the beginnings. How do we begin to enliven? How do we begin to maybe talk to our neighbors? Maybe, who knows? But within reach, because there is that kind, or even maybe there are ways. I mean, one of the problems on the internet is you can have these kind of fascinating conversations, but how do you connect? You're not in the same space. You're not within reach. You can't kind of, go around and say, I thought what you were saying the other day was absolutely ridiculous. You can't do that. Now, actually, among dog walkers in Vancouver, I could do that. I had one dog walker who is absolutely ridiculous. He's very good. Dog walking. So, but you see, I'm looking for, like, the development of, among people, of kinds of concerns, because we have this vacuum, particularly under the Harper government. We have this disappearance, this systematic removal of what's called support for special interest groups. That was very different in the Trudeau era, where there was support for special interest groups, particularly among others for women. And are beginning to see the problem of that omission and what's happening there. I don't know how to do this. I'm not pretending that I do. But it's not enough to have concepts that you can throw around. Like, you have to begin to think much more concretely. Maybe among students, as in Quebec. Who knows? I mean, I'm not, maybe I understand that in Britain, because of some of the kind of point system being used to evaluate faculty, et cetera, which is one of these, you get, it's sort of interesting a little what the consultants do, because they do refining these kind of technologies of how to evaluate faculty work and all that. And you begin to see how faculty are beginning to organize in the UK to make some kind of resistance to the introduction of some of these forms of appraisal. So, I'm not sure where and how it can happen, but I think to begin to see that where it is going on in our lives, like when my daughter-in-law is describing to me like what she has to do on the computer and like in the hours it's taken to her to fuss around with something that is incompetently designed, but she has to do it. That, yes, you can say something about this, can't you? Couldn't you take it up with the union somehow? Well, that's what we talked about.
Okay, on that note, I would like to conclude the formal part of Dorothy Smith's lecture and discussion. And I do want to say that I will be teaching a course on institutional technology called Mastering Social and Organizational Relations in Education in the winter term in the Center for Women's Studies. Okay, there are also other flyers for you to pick up, and certainly Dorothy